Revolutionary greetings, comrades. Steve Forbes one day said, the politician says that we cannot afford tax cut. Maybe we cannot afford the politicians. Today, I want to talk about taxation and tax cut. African countries have been increasing taxation in order to raise the loans and pay the debts, or raising the revenues. Is it realistic? Is it practical? Is the tax regime that is coming across Africa going to liberate Africa, or is going to sink Africa in more poverty? This is what I want to talk about today. Is it possible that you afford tax cut, or it is not possible? Or whether it is hard for us to afford the politicians? So this is the talk of today, and I want us to watch first of all this small video where this person is talking reality about the tax cut and the taxation regimes in Africa. Thank you very much.
Formalize the reality that poor countries can never repay their loans.
Senator, are you saying that you're opposed to debt relief for impoverished countries?
No, we should forgive the debts, but that's not going to help those countries very much.
Okay. What will?
Tax cuts. Some African tax rates are the highest in the world. In Tanzania, the 30% rate kicks in at $475 of income. Plus, they have a 20% value-added tax. It gets added to everything you buy. Those high tax rates make it impossible to build capital in those countries. So nothing gets built, not factories, not roads, not anything. Poor African countries have the lowest wage workers in the world. And yet a company like Nike, for instance, can't put a factory in one of those countries because of the oppressive tax rates. Taxes have killed any possibility of economic development. They've killed any hope of these countries ever helping themselves. And that leaves them completely at the mercy of charity and loans. And here's the worst part. You know why those countries have such high tax rates? Because of us. To show us that they can raise enough money to pay back their loans. But taxes can't raise any money if they kill the economies. So it turns out that the tragic, unintended consequence of our good intentions toward Africa, our kindness, is that we have encouraged those countries to lock themselves into a gruesome economic depression. If we don't urge those countries to cut their tax rates, they will never grow their economies. People will live lifetimes of unemployment. Disease will be rampant. Poverty will be permanent. And children will be hungry. And our charity will never be enough. Never.
Now, having watched that video, there are a few quotes that I want to talk about as we start. I'll start by the first quote by Winston Churchill. He said, "We contend that for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to lift himself up by the handle of the bucket." Ron Paul said one thing, that one thing is clear, that founding fathers never intended a nation where citizens will pay almost a half of what they earn to the government. Now, out of that video, there are a few things we want to talk about. And my topic is tax cut. I know many African countries today are facing the burden of debt. And I'll quote one thing that, of course, Sankara said that's different to what I'm talking about today. Sankara said one thing, that we cannot pay debt because it's not our responsibility. Because those who loaned us, when they are making profit, they never complain. Now they're making loss, they're complaining. That aside, let me get to this tax cut. Out of that discussion we've had, the speaker is very clear that African countries don't need even debt relief. African countries need tax cuts. High taxation. For example, let me quote what's happening in Kenya, for example. In Kenya, for example, the cost of electricity, the tax you pay for electricity is 64%. in fuel, the cost you pay for taxation is 62%. The normal pay as you earn taxation is 30% in Kenya. But the VAT, for example, there's a law that was introduced that tax basic needs. The first question will be, is it really right for a nation to tax basic needs? Basic needs is food or food products. Is it really right for the country to tax basic needs? Those who envision to either produce the Constitution of Kenya never envisioned that we have taxation on basic goods, because these are basic rights. And basic rights is even in the United Nations Charter, is even in human rights charters, and is even in the Constitution. For example, in Kenya, the Bill of Rights, the taxation must be exempted to basic commodities. Now, these people tax basic commodities. The question is simple. For example, there have been so many what you call the structural adjustment coming with IMF for countries to try to repay their loans. Out of that video, the speaker is very clear that in order for African countries to develop themselves, they must come with tax cuts incentives. I've said recently in Kenya here, over 62 companies closed or shut down in January because of high cost of doing business. Citizens pay heavily through the pay-as-you-earn taxation. The cost of electricity, they still pay almost 64%. Food, they pay 16%. All these. How really do our leaders think that they can develop Africa with this model? It's not going to work out. Let's be honest, it's not going to work out. I'll be very clear. The Kenyan government adopted what you call the bottom up, that the money must be given to the people at the bottom so that you can empower them to come up. The question is, if you give money to the people at the bottom to start businesses, how will they come up while the middle class and the upper class are suffering in terms of heavy taxation? How will they purchase the products at the low class? Is it possible? Is it realistic? For example, if I operate a shop here, you give my friend another money for another shop, another friend for another money of that shop, while my shop currently is struggling to survive. How do you expect the next shop will survive while you're depending on the same clientele? It's not going to work out. The African governments, the best way to actually develop themselves is not to tax their citizens heavily in order to pay or repay the debts. It is upon African countries, wherever and whenever they are, to ensure that they introduce tax cut and tax incentives that can attract African investors first before even focus on the foreign investors. For example, we have so many African investors who are out there. We have so many Africans in diaspora who are ready to invest. But it's not very easy. One day I realized that, and I came across a story by Africans, especially Kenyans in diaspora, who wanted to start a university in Kenya. But the cost and the requirement that they were given to start a university in Kenya was so expensive that they moved that university and university outside Kenya. Let's be practical and realistic. A country that tries to tax itself to the future or to the prosperity is like a person standing on the bucket and holding the hand of the bucket to lift himself up. It is totally impossible. The African countries must come with tax incentives to allow investors to come in. Now in Kenya here, the Kenya Revenue Authority that deals with taxation has decided to do away with the tax reliefs. How? An investor needs a conducive environment to invest so as to employ more people. For example, if one company shut down, one company maybe employ over 2,000 or 1,000 people. If this company shut down, how is this government going to raise money and revenue for his own goods? The African government borrow a lot, but they don't even put them in investment that can produce or can recruit more revenue so that we can pay back the debt. African countries borrow. In fact, African countries and African leaders have stolen everything in the continent. The only thing they're left with is to borrow and steal that money that you borrowed so that you tax people more to repay the money. It's not going to work out. They reach a time whereby our country, for example, borrow from maybe IMF, then they use 50% of the borrowing from IMF to pay another loan to China, then they remain this 50%, they steal it, and maybe they invest 10%. How do you expect to reproduce? I think it's a high time that the African countries need also to think of the cost of their governance. It's an item that will reduce heavy salaries, allowances, and many things. We cut the budget of funding the government. The government is so expensive for the citizens. It's time that the government must reduce its costs, and we must reduce the cost of the government because we cannot afford it. You see? So once we reduce the cost of government, then we can introduce tax incentives so that people can start their business. We can have tax holidays. You can employ so many people that people can come in and actually you target the people employed there through the pay as you earn taxation so that they can pay more. Then reduce the cost of taxation in basic commodities so that people can also enjoy basic commodities. Today, people are dying because of hunger. There's no employment, there's no anything else. Then the country still continue to tax itself. So the question, Pan-Africans and Africans, wherever you are, I don't think it's right for the government to continue overtaxing its citizens in the name of trying to develop itself to the future. It's not going to work out. The African government must start coming up with tax incentives and tax cuts so that they can invite more investors to come in. And these more investors can actually increase the investment in Africa and employ more people. Those investments must start with the Africans. We should not, first of all, rush to invite the white investors. Africans have the potential to develop Africa. Let's invite African diasporas in a country. Let the president sit down with all Africans in diaspora, all wealthy people in Africa. Give them opportunity. Show them the space in the business in your country. Give them incentives. A businessman will always invest where there's an incentive. And they can make profit out of it. But when you keep on taxing our citizens more, where they are unemployed, we are not getting employment, we are going to kill ourselves. We are going to die in poverty and in anger and languish forever. And citizens are going to rebel and react to this government because they're not going to die anymore. This is the topic we pick from, these are the key points we pick from this video. Keep on spreading the news of Pan-Africanism, the news of revolution. Let's keep on pushing together because revolution must actually come true.